begin slowly with introduction. So most of you by now know who we are, but just in case there's a few newcomers, the European Capital of Democracy is a non-profit organization based in Vienna, and it was founded by the Innovation in Politics Institute, which is a European-wide organization dedicated to improving politics with offices in Vienna and Berlin. We have over 20 European countries, partners in over 20 European countries and beyond. We have the newly expanded European City Network with our newest members, Rotterdam, Sarajevo and Krakow, Sofia and Krakow, excuse me, taking us to 24 cities from 15 European countries. Vienna has just opened its Democracy Year as the second ever European Capital of Democracy, and we very much look forward to finding out who will be the next European Capital of Democracy in 2025. This is a Network of Towns project, which is co-funded by the European Union, and the cities that we're working most closely with to develop this webinar series are Antwerp, Barcelona, Bologna, Braga, Brussels, and Cascais. Today, we are going to be talking about disinformation in the city with our guest experts, Paul Costello from the German Marshall Fund, Graham. I will let you pronounce your surname when you introduce yourself.
I apologies. Yeah, I struggle myself sometimes. So it's Graham Wetherall-Grujić.
Grujić,
but I'm not really saying the last part right.
Okay. Yeah. Graham Wetherall-Grujić from the Innovation in Politics Institute, who's the lead expert in democracy technologies, and Mathis Dippon, who is the Democracy Year Manager for the European Capital of Democracy. So a quick overview of the agenda. We've started here with the introduction and moved straight on to the presentations, which will be followed by a short Q&A and finally a summary and outlook to 2025. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I will share my screen so that you can see slides. It's very nice to be with all of you. I'm Paul Costello, Senior Program Manager in the GMF Cities team based in Berlin. The German Marshall Fund Cities team is working with cities across North America and Europe around core issues where we think cities should have a bigger role. And so that includes focusing on democracy, social, economic, and climate justice, equity and agency, and more broadly, the role of cities in international affairs. Now, I'm going to talk to you specifically about our Disinformation Playbook. And for that, I'll also just put the link to the playbook in the chat because I'm going to be covering it very quickly here and just going over kind of some top level stuff, but there's a lot more detailed content and examples in the playbook, which I encourage you to have a look at. Very quickly in terms of context, so the Cities program, as I've mentioned, has been working on cities and democracy for some time. We've been engaging with different cities across Europe and North America on this, and the topic of disinformation had come up from several of the cities that we work with as something where they were seeking to learn more and acquire new tools and capacities in addressing this locally. And as we started to look into this, we eventually connected with the Melbourne Center for Cities at the University of Melbourne, who was hearing very similar things from the cities that they work with and who had actually just started putting together a coalition of Australian researchers to carry out a research project on this topic. And so we partnered with them on this project rather than duplicating work, with us taking more of a focus on the European and North American cities and perspectives and them and their networks in Australasia. Ika Treisberg, who's also a GMF fellow based at the University of Melbourne, is the mastermind behind this project. She can't be here to present as well today, but she's really the person who's been weaving all of this together. And so for folks looking for more detailed information, I'd be happy to connect you with her. So this is the playbook that was published in August and that I put the link to in the chat. We wanted this to be co-created with cities and experts. And so while this brought together researchers and experts from different universities and backgrounds, we had about 14 city officials and representatives and other sector experts, academics, media and disinformation analysts participating in this process. So we had a total of 40 different people who helped us co-create this playbook in 3 different workshops. Because of the different time zones, every workshop was doubled up, and so there were a total of 6 workshops. But really, this was something that was put together by 40 different experts, led by the team of experts. On page 6 of the playbook, you can see the contributors who agreed to be named. Obviously, on this topic, there's different politics and sensitivities, and so we wanted it to be an option for folks to participate, even if they weren't, if their names weren't publicly shared, especially folks working in city government and city administrations where disinformation is particularly sensitive, or where there's threats of harassment and other issues. Very quickly, in why cities, this is a topic where often people focus at the national and international level, foreign interference and other aspects, but really, being in the cities team, and I'm sure many people on this webinar are keenly aware of kind of the importance of cities, but just to briefly reiterate, it's not just where a majority of the world's population live, but it's also, more importantly from our perspective, the place where people experience democracy on a daily basis. And so many of the decisions that impact people's lives and their experience with democratic governance are shaped at the local level. And so this is a critical space to engage on this topic, but it's also the place where disinformation manifests and can have physical, sometimes violent, sometimes just disruptive manifestations. And so it's important not to neglect cities, which is what we feel has been the case for some time now. City officials and local stakeholders aren't equipped. They're not part of frameworks, protocols, collaborations on this topic. And so that's why we were hearing this from the cities that we work with, and why we wanted to fill this gap with this playbook. And also think it's a particularly worrying gap, or was a particularly worrying gap, because there's such opportunity in this. The city government being the most trusted level of government commonly across many countries, and trust being such a critical element to people's relationship to democracy, we felt that it's a huge opportunity to engage cities on various topics related to democracy, and especially disinformation. But it's also a place and a level of governance that allows for learning and experimentation. So cities can learn from each other. That's very much the spirit of this network and series, but also in partnership with academia and local stakeholders. And it's really a place where we can see different levels of collaboration yielding great results. As I mentioned, cities are a place where disinformation campaigns can lead to threats to public safety, can fracture community relations and cohesion. It undermines trust. It can undermine democratic processes. We also see, in some places, cities limiting access to city council meetings because of the increasing kind of violence or aggressive discourse, and having impacts that are negative for democracy as opposed to positive. Also, cities do a lot of work in areas that we've seen kind of trigger disinformation campaigns and movements, and those are around health and well-being, gender and sexual diversity, climate action and sustainability, migrant, cultural and religious diversity, and urban planning. These are all areas that in our initial survey of cities were flagged as topics and areas that were triggering, or where disinformation really coalesced and had an impact, and where cities are increasingly struggling to make progress on policies and practices because of disinformation campaigns. And so the recent obvious examples include the 15-minute city or the ultra-low emission zones in London, really areas where connecting something like a traffic regulation to a global conspiracy is really making progress on these issues a lot harder at the local level. So to start off in the process of co-creating this playbook, as I mentioned, we gathered this cross-sector group of participants and came together to agree on a set of principles that we thought were essential for the playbook, but also for the spirit of developing this together. And they're listed in the playbook. I won't go through all of them here, but just to highlight a couple. One I've already touched upon, which is the importance of trust. The importance that this work be non-partisan to be effective, and that it really can be challenging, but really keeping it separate from politics and political divisions uniquely. Another important one is that disinformation has individual, organizational, and societal consequences, and that all three are important and all three need to be addressed. And so this goes from kind of the personal or individual targeting that can happen of people running for office or discouraging people of running for office or doing their role in the municipality, to kind of the inability to function properly as an organization, or the societal consequences of kind of eroding trust and belief in democratic processes or in facts or in certain data or other key elements. And then the last one maybe is just that this, to be effective and innovative, this work must be partnered and cross-sector. So it's important not to do this work as a city alone, and also to be engaged in learning from and with other cities as one does this. As I mentioned earlier, the playbook has a lot of content in it. I really encourage you to at least skim through. It's structured and organized, and so you don't need to read all of it. We wanted to keep it shorter in the development, but really the process of co-creation led to such a wealth of ideas, suggestions, and points that we really weren't comfortable trimming down for the sake of brevity. So it is longer than we had hoped, but we hope that people can still make use of it by flipping to the relevant sections. And so now in kind of the key recommendations and outputs, I'm really going to cover them generally without going into much detail. The first one is around the importance of building trust. And so not just building trust, but also leveraging trust. And so it's important for local stakeholders and cities to really map out and deeply understand who trusted institutions are and by whom. Not everyone trusts the same institutions and people and organizations. What information is trusted, which people are trusted, and what are places of trust? What are really even the physical places where messages can really come across, get across to people and not just bounce off of walls. This is especially because disinformation kind of preys on certain societal divisions. Understanding who in society trusts whom and what type of information is really critical. The other core area was that of building community, and this follows on from the previous trust argument, but it's really about understanding and addressing the fault lines in community. What are the divisions in locally that are that matter, that can be dangerous or that can be vulnerable to disinformation campaigns. Understanding that is kind of the first step, and mapping that and developing some sort of a self-assessment or self-awareness around that locally is important. And it's important to help build community narratives and vision, and not just the narratives, really understanding this when you're working to reduce these divisions or these inequalities in the city. It's really, you need to always keep in mind not just the communication perspective, but the actual work, and vice versa, doing the actual work without thinking of the communication impact and the vulnerability to disinformation is also very important. Communicating and listening, this seems quite obvious, but thinking about this in a deep level is really important. Listening is part of the building community that I referred to earlier as well, but really being able to detect kind of vulnerabilities, threats, areas that can be that can readily lead to dangerous disinformation campaigns. And the communication is always important, but on this topic, thinking more strategically about communication, not just from the communications team of the city or of local institutions, but really across organizations and how you communicate, and also being sure that the increase or amount of disinformation not lead organizations or cities to communicate less. So it's important to communicate more and better, but not to kind of retreat in front of the increasingly chaotic and kind of complex world information ecosystem. Collaboration, I referred to earlier, but really leveraging different partnerships and opportunities for communication. Again, this network is a great example of that, but also locally across sectors, civil society organizations, religious groups, universities, media organizations, journalists, and then on a more horizontal level, other cities in your region, in your country, internationally, in Europe that are dealing with similar issues. How can you learn from them, see what others are doing, kind of refine and adapt what you're doing based on the lessons and experiences of others? And also what we've referred to internally as kind of the collective heat shield of this is not a space that cities tend to be very active in. There's not a disinformation response unit in any city that I know of. Actually, maybe in Jakarta there is, but really being collectively less afraid of experimenting and innovating in the space and really thinking, well, being able to go to a mayor or to a provincial or national government saying, other cities are doing it this way, and so we'd want to try and do something similar, and kind of using each other to be able to do more work in this space. And of course, multi-level. So, being engaged with your national government or regional authorities, and also below, sort of at the neighborhood and district level, depending on the governance framework of your city, being sure that you have kind of contact points and that you're sharing things across levels. It's very important. And then lastly, to wrap up, I mean, as I mentioned, the playbook has a lot of different things in it, but we've also structured these types of activities and practices and policies along what we call the disinformation, or what others also call the disinformation continuum. Really looking at preemption and early detection, so understanding the community fault lines that I was referring to earlier, and communication strategies and storytelling and local narratives, but also then the pre-bunking and spread prevention, kind of how you can actively work with community to reinforce social expectations and deplatforming dangerous entities, and then lastly the debunking and recovery. And what can you do after an episode that has been particularly harmful? Counter information, counter narratives, community outreach. The recent example of the riots and the racist riots in the UK are an important one. Kind of how do you bring the community together to talk about what has happened, but also to heal and prevent, or try and prevent or reduce the chances of something terrible like that happening again. And with that, that's my contact as well as Ika's. I don't know if we have time for questions, but please don't hesitate to reach out if we don't.
Paul, thank you very much. We will have a short Q&A session at the end. I know you have to rush it off, so I would ask anyone with direct questions for Paul or Ika to ask them per email. We will also link the response playbook directly on the webpage, so people can access it there. Thanks very much, Paul.
Great, thank you.
So we hand over now to Graham, please.
So thanks Laura for the invitation to talk today. Thanks also to Paul. I know he had to shoot off, but I did want to mention the playbook which the team produced has been a kind of key resource to the research that I've been doing over the last couple of months. So yeah, thank you to the team in absentia. So I'm going to talk about a specific case of disinformation in the wind energy sector in Germany. So again, focusing on the local level. If I can move the slide on, because I think there's a tendency when we talk about disinformation, as Paul said in his presentation, to think about these big national level cases. And I think the most obvious recent example was the overturning of the first round of Romania's presidential election after it transpired that a TikTok campaign financed by Russia had been spreading disinformation. In cases like these, national governments have a lot of resources to throw at them. The EU is now moving to see if they can prosecute TikTok on the basis of the DSA Act. But disinformation comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And at the local level, governments typically don't have these kind of resources for dealing with these cases. And I've picked a specific example in Germany today, which I think shows how difficult it can be for a local government to deal with disinformation, but also how problems at the local level can end up having national level repercussions. So just as a little bit of background, Germany's 2030 sustainability targets depend heavily on wind energy. They're one of Europe's main developers of wind energy. And a law passed back in 2022 specified that 2% of Germany's territory will be reserved for wind farms, which is a huge proportion of land. And it also means a lot of local residents who are going to have wind farms directly where they are living. Now, according to sources in the German wind energy industry, one of the main obstacles to hitting the targets for wind energy is local campaigns and legal challenges. And disinformation plays a huge role in these processes. Local residents, whether they believe the disinformation or not, have a real incentive to circulate it, to try and slow down the process, to try and undermine confidence among locals, but also within the government. And governments confronted with this disinformation often don't have the resources they need to debunk it. So among the most common objections to wind farms are the appearance. People don't like how they look, the impact on property values, but there's also been a real trend towards concerns about impact on health. It's a persistent myth that wind farms emit high levels of ultrasound, and that's very low frequency sounds, which are actually too low for human beings to hear. But if they're loud enough, they can do things like make your floor shake. If you've ever lived, as I have, on a road where trucks are rolling past all day, or you have an underground near you, you can feel this stuff. Now, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that wind farms generate unhealthy levels of ultrasound or even perceptible levels of ultrasound. There's also no evidence connecting ultrasound to health problems. But over the last decade, a number of local governments around Germany have cited ultrasound and health concerns in particular, when voting against wind farms in their area. And there's even a case in France, actually, where a court awarded compensation to a family living near a wind farm, and they cited infrasound and the impact of infrasound as one of the reasons for awarding compensation. But I'd like to focus today a little bit on this graph, because it's one which is shown up in disinformation campaigns on websites and on flyers in Germany on a regular basis over the last 15 years. This graph comes from a report which was conducted in 2005 by the German Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources. They conducted this report because they have a lot of earthquake sensors around Germany, and they wanted to see if the infrasound generated by wind farms was going to disrupt their equipment. And what they determined is, as you can see in this graph, is that at a distance of about 1 kilometer, you could expect 90 decibels of infrasound. Now, the only problem with this is that it's completely false. And the values cited here are actually about 4,000 times too high. So decibels is a logarithmic scale, which means a difference of 30 decibels actually is actually out by an magnitude of 1,000. The study was published in 2005. It wasn't until 2020 that somebody noticed the mistake. And it was only in 2021, more than a year later, that the report was actually withdrawn from circulation. To make matters worse, in 2018, the German national broadcaster ZDF cited the report and these graphs in a documentary about the health risks of wind farms. They invited an expert from the same federal institute who not only repeated the false measurements, but also claimed that this could have a negative impact on people's health. Now, it's since been withdrawn from ZDF's online library, but it's very easy to find online, and it's still doing the rounds amongst anti-wind campaigners. Let's stay here for a second. So I think what I find really fascinating about this case is it shows the complexity of what local politicians are up against. So if you're presented with a report that was issued by a federal agency, written in very complicated language, which you don't necessarily understand, and which has been given airtime by a national broadcaster, how do you react? Now, at the very least, and this is what I've heard talking to people in the wind sector in Germany, this report alone has been responsible for frequent delays to planning permission for building wind farms. Local politicians want to check the facts before they approve something. In other cases, it's a convenient excuse for local politicians to vote against a project which was unpopular with their residents anyway. So they don't always have an incentive to get to the bottom of things. Now, as I said, the mistake eventually became apparent in 2020, and it happened when a small community in the north of Bavaria voted against a wind farm, and a local academic who was an environmental scientist decided he wanted to get to the bottom of things. He took a look at the report they published and found the mistake fairly quickly, and then published a blog online refuting the report. I've included an excerpt from his report here, not because I expect people to understand it, but precisely because I have made efforts to understand this and can't. It's written in very complicated language, and I think it highlights the fact that for a good year, local authorities in Germany had to either trust a federal institute's report or a blog written in very complicated language that was going to be very hard for them to understand. He engaged in an ongoing dispute with the federal agency, who eventually revoked their report in 2021. So move on to the last slide. So just to draw some conclusions from this, first of all, dis and misinformation can come from unexpected places. I think we tend to think of outright lies that are spread by malicious actors. Actually, this piece of misinformation came from a federal agency and was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And the problem persisted because there was no mechanism in place to unearth mistakes like this. I think as well, it highlights just how difficult the lot of local politicians can be in dealing with issues like this. A national government confronted with disinformation on this scale has researchers, has teams who are devoted to debunking these kind of claims. Local politicians not only lack these kind of resources, they sometimes even lack the incentive to get involved in debates like this. If, for example, wind farms are unpopular in their community, it can be a lot easier to look the other way and to cite a study like this as a reason for voting against. Now, if I still have a couple of minutes, I wanted to highlight one possible response that to disinformation in the wind farm sector, again, to highlight how there's no one solution to the issue of disinformation at the local level, and it really needs to be tailor-made. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that I think fact-checking has come a very long way in recent years. It's doubtful if a study like this were published today that it would have survived so long out in the wild. But I think the example also highlights the fact that sometimes refuting false claims isn't always the most effective approach. And I think we also need to think about the incentives. So what incentives did local residents have for sharing this misinformation? In some ways, it wasn't important whether they believed the graph or not. Their goal was to disrupt the process of local government and hopefully eventually to prevent wind farms from being built at all. For local politicians, again, the incentives to investigate and to try and debunk this were at the very least complicated. And one of the most successful approaches in the green energy community, which has now been deployed throughout Germany, but also in Denmark and the UK, has been to start giving local communities a financial stake in local wind farms. And this graph here is from a study conducted a couple of years ago, which shows that in areas where communities are given a financial stake, there's a lot more support for not only for the existing wind farms, but people are open to more wind farms being built. And in areas like this, disinformation ceases to play such a decisive role. Suddenly, these kind of claims disappear, and the incentive to spread this kind of false information is effectively undermined. So, yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Graham. Sorry, I'm busy scribbling notes. It's very interesting that changing the ownership structure to a more community-based one can have such a great impact. That's really nice to hear. So we'll hand over now to Mathis, please, for the final presentation.
So I want to present an approach, I think a creative approach to combat disinformation through gaming. So we already heard that, well, disinformation, fake news is a profound threat to liberal democracy, and we need a big set of countermeasures to really limit the negative effects of disinformation. And I think we need new alliances and new tools to do so. And I don't know if you know, but half of the population in Europe plays video games. And what if we could use this immersive educational approach to make people aware of the threat of disinformation, fake news, and also maybe empower them to counteract misinformation, disinformation. And that's why we've invented Truth, Lies, and Democracy. It's a game jam to mobilize an overlooked community, the gaming community, to design playful, interactive intervention against this profound threat to liberal democracy. We had a great launch last year in Barcelona with 3 national and 3 local teams of young game developer. And they created 6 games in the course of 2 days. We had on our stream 100 live participants and 450 via YouTube. And we had, as I said, 6 games. You can check them out on our website, and I'm sure we can insert the link as well. And it was a great start of this young and ambitious project. And next year, the game jam Truth, Lies, and Democracy will take place in the new title-holding city, the new title-holding European Capital of Democracy, Vienna, and it's going to take place in autumn 2025. Our aim is to have 5 local and 5 international teams. So if you want to send a team to Vienna next year, please let me know. The winning games will be presented at the big European gaming conference called Game City. And we are also learned a lot from the pilot in Barcelona and will update the event design here and there a little bit. So this is a big invitation to become a partner of this innovative format, you can define a category of the game jam, you can send a team, you can also provide prizes, catering, or hardware to the event, or support the communication and dissemination. Maybe you're working with young people and you're interested in using the games in your daily work. This could be also an approach to work together. Just send me an email when you're interested, and you can find more information on our website. We will share the link, I guess, also after the call.
Thank you very much. So we now have a few minutes for some questions to either Graham or Mathis. So you can write your questions directly in the chat, and I will just field them as they come in. So I have one for you, Graham. So regarding this community ownership and how it's effective against disinformation campaigns, do you have an example of the impact of community ownership, or could you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure, yeah, of course. It's first of all, I think it's been in use, this idea of giving local communities ownership of green energy sources has been in use, I think, in Denmark for about 20 years now, and it's a process which is gaining in popularity. I first became aware of it through a case in the north of Germany, where a local politician had been concerned about the level of disinformation circulating against a proposed wind farm, and she began investigating different models and came across this community ownership. I mean, it's kind of anecdotal evidence, but their wind farm got built without problems and with very low levels of resistance. The study that I cited at the very end on the final slide, which I can share in the chat, comes from the UK, and it was a comparative study which looked at towns and villages near wind farms that were privately owned, some which were co-owned by local communities, and some which were owned outright by the community. And what that demonstrated was that support for wind farms was a lot higher in those areas. I'm not sure if there's empirical studies on the impact on disinformation specifically. Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that it does depend a little bit on how these projects are implemented. I mentioned that in some cases it's a co-ownership thing. In some cases, people are given the option of buying in, so investing in a stake. And I think the problem with that is it tends to appeal to the people who are already sympathetic to the cause of building a wind farm. The hardest people to reach are the people who are least likely to invest personally, and it's definitely not a panacea. There's still going to be local opposition. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting though, because there was also a community-owned wind farm in the UK that was one of the finalists for the Innovation in Politics Awards, I think the 2023 edition, and that wasn't sort of implemented against disinformation, but it was more to balance out the impact of the rise in fuel prices. But it's just interesting how it can have these unintended positive consequences. Now, I don't see a great influx of questions. Aha, just in the nick of time, Ina. So, how can you measure the success of anti-disinformation campaigns? Thoughts on that, please?
That's a great question, and it's a very difficult question. I mean, I think there's kind of a partner question there of how can you measure the impact of disinformation campaigns, which again is something which there are people working on it, but it can be very difficult to prove. For example, and I don't know what the legal basis exactly for the overturning of the presidential election in Romania was, but I could imagine legal challenges to that overturning would be based on the fact that it's extremely difficult to prove whether the disinformation directly led to the outcome of the election of the election. So for me, that was a big deal to see a court intervening in a national election. I think it's one of the biggest legal decisions we've seen on disinformation. All of that to say that it's difficult to measure, and I think in some ways you have to take a pragmatic approach. For example, when we're talking about wind energy, I would say once you've introduced measures and the problem of all these delays caused by disinformation start to recede, then then you can talk about a successful campaign. But it's one of the real difficulties in the field, because proving a causal link between disinformation and outcomes is hard, and proving a causal link between debunking and positive conclusions is also really difficult.
More looking at patterns of correlations, and as that builds up over time, it becomes more and more convincing. I think what we'll do is we will move on to the summary and the outlook for 2025. So it only leaves to say thank you very much to Graham and Mathis, and of course Paul, for their wonderful presentations. So here we are at the end of 2024, and we have 5 more webinars coming up in 2025. The first 2 will be in February and March, and they will both be focusing on inclusive social city development, which is the focus topic from the city of Cascais. The first one will be an expert joining us to give insights on the topic. And the second one in March will be the city of Cascais, joined by 2 of our other European City Network members to share examples from their own cities. So I suppose that brings us to the end of our webinar series in 2024. Thank you very much for all taking the time to join us today. And all the slides and information and link to the response playbook will be on our webpage very, very shortly, as well as the link to the recording, which is always available on our YouTube channel.